So,
like 10 trains.
yeah, I think this would.
Good afternoon and welcome to our second forum regarding our 25-26 QAP allocation plan. Just some housekeeping items. Please make sure that you all have placed yourselves on mute unless you are speaking. And when you do speak, if you have any comments, please state your name and what organization you are from. And with that, I will turn this over to Mark Shelburne.
All right. Well, there you go. So I'll go ahead and just jump right in. The point of today, primarily, as is the case with all these sorts of gatherings, is to hear from you, the attendees. And so, but in order to prompt input and suggestions, comments, questions, arguments, debates, etc., we figured it was good to walk through briefly an overview of what you saw announced on Thursday. And so I'm just going to give, again, just a very high level overview summary of all these provisions. And then we'll show you the point scoring. And and then before that, we'll give just a very brief demonstration of policy map. And so that's the plan of action here today. But please, as the spirit moves you, feel free to jump in with any questions, comments, debates, arguments, etc. All that's not only welcome, that's the point of today. So not much of any consequence to talk about in section 1. That's all pretty much the same as what you have seen throughout the years in Kentucky's QAP. And, just a few minor tweaks here or there. This is the first big change, and there's actually multiple changes here. The first one jumps right out at you, which is that there's a tremendously increased percent of the credits proposed to go to new construction relative to rehab. And so that's the what you see there with the split between existing supply and new supply. And so the other big changes here are with the new supply, splitting it up by counties and having that split of counties be on a per capita basis. And so these 5 right here, Jefferson, Fayette, Boone, Campbell, Kenton, have 33% of Kentucky's population. And so that would then mean that the remaining 66% of 90% would then go to the other. I forgot the total number of counties you have in Kentucky. I know it's a lot, but it's the remaining number of counties there. And so Tammy, yes, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, is there a reason why Boone, Kenton, and Campbell have all been lumped together?
Well, for that, I'm going to have to defer to my KHC colleagues because that was a Kentucky-specific judgment call, and I'm not the expert on your state relative to anyone else. So I'm hoping Terry or Anthony can jump in with the explanation of that perspective.
So I think the Boone, Campbell, and Kenton counties were some of the larger northern Kentucky counties, and so that's why we included them in that grouping.
But like with all this, these are all very much open to comments. You're welcome to share thoughts on how this could be organized differently. This doing it on a per capita basis has a tremendous amount of defensibility and logic to it, but it's not the only way to do it. And the split of how it gets divided, especially what counts as urban versus balance of state, that's there's no iron rules about that. There's some obvious distinctions, but there are judgment calls to be made one way or another along those lines. And I happened to see Tammy's little electronic hand go up, and so I don't know that I'll be able to if anyone else does it. So if you do pop it up and I can't see it on my screen, please feel free to reach out some other way. And so that's the split of the credits. So those are the distinct competitions. So then the next is this notion of having limits within the counties. And so you can read it right there. The idea being that KHC as a statewide agency has a responsibility to serve the entire state. And so this allows a split of the resource among the different counties. So, and we've also put in here what I like to call the kindergarten cookie rule, that you don't get a second one unless someone else has at least gotten their first. And so that's the whole notion here of at least one new supply award. And so that's the idea there behind the county limits, is again just to have continue the notion of serving the whole state, having a per capita distribution across the Commonwealth. So the nonprofit adjustment, this is really just so as to comply with the Section 482. It's actually a limitation. Agencies can't award more than 90% of their resource to entities that don't have a nonprofit. And I realize that's like a quadruple negative, but that's how you're technically supposed to say it. It's kind of ridiculous. So, but since every agency wants to use all of their credits, that means it's a 10% set aside. That's where that comes from. So basically that's just what this says. If after the KHC does the initial awards, the result wouldn't be 10% goes to nonprofits, then they would adjust it to make sure that it does. So as I understand it, that's not not likely to occur. You have a good amount of nonprofit activity in your state, but in some states that is an issue, like Arkansas, either last year, year before last, had no nonprofit applicants, none, which probably an aberration, but it can happen. So this next one, and I'll invite my colleagues, particularly Anthony, to add to this if any of them would like to. But this is the current proposed way to encourage participation by underserved, underrepresented participants. And so previously, the QAP had awarded points for various types of partnership structures, development ventures, joint venture agreement type things. And so this is taking a different approach to where not everyone is going to try to compete for those points, but instead there's going to be at least one that has the type of structure that's described in this section. So it's a change in approach, but it's the same spirit as I understand it from the previous QAP. So I'll pause there again if anyone with KHC wants to jump in, add to this, or anything else I've covered, or any other comments from anyone else before we move on from set asides. And it would work like the nonprofit, that if there isn't one that gets awarded with fitting this description, then KHC will reach down the awards to pick up one that does. So no comments, added thoughts. All right. We can always come back to it. So that covers set asides. So that takes us to selection criteria. And as you know, the notion of thresholds and underwriting, the other two general categories, those go in KHC's guidelines. We don't cover them in the QAP. So what we've got here are the set asides and the selection criteria. So the existing supply selection criteria, again, this is only for 10% of the credits. So it's a really small competition. The idea being here that since it's such a small competition, there really isn't a need to use points. And this is a model that other states have tried and successfully over the years. And so what would happen is you propose your project, you describe how it fits in these different notions, and then KHC would do its analysis. And this first one, ranking properties based on need, that's actually been in place for a while. This got in place from when I previously worked on the QAP. I don't know, like 5, 6 years ago. So that's not a new concept. And then these other two are sort of new, but they're not radically different. They're very similar to what you'll see in other states. And so the idea is you would present again how your project fits in these three categories, and KHC does a comprehensive evaluation of all of them and picks the ones that best fit these three criteria. And so that's how this competition would work for the 10% of credits. So questions, comments on that before moving on to new supply? We're doing really good on time here. We're only about 10 minutes in here.
Hey, good afternoon, Mark. This is Mike Hines. I'm with Winterwood. Question about preference to applications with no acquisition costs. Is debt assumption excluded or included in the definition of acquisition costs under this criteria?
That's a good question. Probably shouldn't try to answer that one on the fly. So that's we'll try to remember that, but if you would be so kind as to submit some thoughts along those lines in an email QAP comment, we'd appreciate it.
Follow-up question, if I may. How is the 10% allocation for renovation determined?
Oh, right, geographically, yeah, it's statewide. So it's again, like since it's so small, there's no reason to have a split of it geographically. So these projects are all competing against each other all across the state.
Understood. That's close, but why is 10% determined to be the appropriate amount?
That's the policy choice. KHC sees that the state has a tremendous need to create new housing units, and so this type of activity doesn't. And so the proposal is to use the QAP to help the state address its tremendously growing shortage of affordable housing. But again, that's a policy choice, and someone could propose a different one, no doubt. So I see Kitty has a hand raised. So you may be on mute if you're speaking. See if I can unmute. All right. Maybe not. Maybe it was an inadvertent hand, but yeah, Kitty McCoon has a hand raised, so I don't. All right. Yeah, got some chats here. Looks like Anthony's got that covered. Any other questions, comments on this section? All right. Hearing none. But again, we can always come back to it if you think of it later. So new supply selection criteria. So this is what I'm sure most of you focused on for multiple reasons. It's 90% of the credits, and it's what most type of deals most folks do. So there's two separate competitions in here, again, between urban and balance of state. And these are the criteria. So a significant share, that is basically the same as what you've had in the past and how it would work. So there's not a whole lot to cover there. Policy map, though, is new and different. And it's new and different in that in the mechanism, the concept is, at least we're trying to have it be the same from what had been the Opportunity 360 resource that is no longer available. And so if we were going to have something that accomplished its same goals, had to figure it out. And before actually I even got involved with KHC and doing this work, they very wisely realized that one of the best ways to accomplish what they had been doing with Opportunity 360 was through policy map. And so we have spent a lot of time working on this resource and how to make it available. And that's actually, that and a lot of this drafting is where we have spent our time. That's why you don't have slides. That's why there's not more explanatory materials, because we really spend all of our time trying to come up with the best policies. That's where all the time we've got available. So that's what our focus has been on. So in other words, that's another way of saying that's why we don't have slides for this, because we didn't take the time for that. We took the time to focus on the policies. And so and this is a publicly available resource. You can sign up, you can pay for it like KHC has, but you don't have to. They have tremendous amount of data that's publicly available. And that's what we've used is their publicly available data. And once I'm done going through this, time permitting, once I'm going through the QAP and the scoring spreadsheet, I'll do some policy map demonstrating, but I want to be sure we get through all these materials first. So there's 4 criteria, and the idea is that, and again, I'll show how this works, but you find your site and you see how it does in these 4. Well, and there's 4, but there's only 3 they're going to apply to any one site. These first 2, renter cost burdens, median household income, they apply to every project, new construction project. But then employment density is only for balance of state, and road network density is only for urban. So you'll find your site in these different categories. And if you've looked at the website, which I hope you have, then you can see this is how you do the analysis. You click on the housing tab, then you click further down on the affordability cost burdens. Then you click on renter cost burdens. It's like an outline hierarchy. You keep going down into it. And so, and you find how your site does. And then what you'll do is you'll present that to KHC. You'll say, I'm in zip code 1234 and my renter cost burden is 50%. And then KHC will rank that relative to someone who was in zip code 456. And if they have a rental cost burden of 40%, then you'll do better than them. That's the concept behind it. Yes, Tammy, go ahead.
I failed to state my full name a while ago. Tammy Stansbury with Woda Cooper Companies. So if scoring will be at KHC's discretion on this, will we? No. Okay, will not.
No, it's relative. It's not a discretion. Everybody gets ranked.
Okay, but will we know like maximum points for each scoring criteria, or what percentage of the total scoring will each criteria be worth?
That's what we'll look at next, is the spreadsheet that shows the total amount of points for these categories relative to the other point categories. So that's a good question. Yeah, so I got a question here in the comment about the bonds are mostly in the urban areas. That's definitely known that bond deals almost exclusively, I don't know the exact ratio, the exact correct term, do go in urban areas. I don't know how that relates to the urban areas as defined in here, because I know there are other areas of the state that someone could consider to be urban, but that's a comment to make. And so I would encourage Tracy, you to submit that as a comment. And so that's just one of these choices. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily. Yeah, so then there's a comment about debt assumption that we'll have to come back to. Yeah, so it says here 2010 data. You're right, that's not ideal for the data to be that old. It's but we did spend a lot of time, again, I can't emphasize that enough, trying to figure out which of the policy map data groups were the most relevant and best to use. And these 4 stood out as having the most logical relationship to what we thought mattered for a good project, and had the best form of data that was available. Like these are percents within, so like for example, median household income, that's your percent within your area. So that means that the Eastern Kentucky is not really competing with another part of the area. It's not going to be inherently worse off. It's because it's compared to its own area. So I'm greatly summarizing, of course. And so when you apply those concepts, then you get it down to these are the 4 that are the best. And you're right, 2010 data is not ideal, but that's what's available within these. I wish they had 2020 data. That certainly would be better. And maybe they will by the time we do this next year. I'm not sure why it's only 2010, but it's at least not wrong data. It's just old data. So that's policy map. Again, time permitting, we'll get a live action demonstration of that. Yeah, well, and 2010 is old, but if y'all are more than welcome. One of the many reasons that we encourage folks to look at the policy map, it wasn't just to get your familiarity with it, but in case someone had a better idea of which criteria to use. And that's another consideration to take into this. Is very easy, as with any of these criteria, to poke a hole in it and say, that's why this criteria has a problem. And that's almost all those are right. But the question is that flaw in the criteria so bad that you shouldn't use it? And if so, what's going to take its place? Because if you do that with everything, eventually you just come down to no criteria or one or two that are tremendously dominant in the way that scoring works. And so, which basically means that it's all tiebreakers. And so I don't think anyone wants that. So we want criteria. And so we just need to decide which ones work the best. Oh, interesting, Samuel. That's a good point. Yeah, maybe the 2010 is just the boundary area. That's interesting. That may be. So could be the data's not that old, but the block groups are that old, the way they drew the boundaries. That may be. I wish I was more of an expert on that kind of thing. There's always more to learn about this data. So that could be how that works. So thank you. Yeah, they haven't updated the block group boundaries, but they've updated the data. That would make more sense. Other thoughts, comments, questions, arguments? All right. Well, again, we can come back to it, and we hopefully will, time permitting. So this next one is permanent below market sources. This is continuing in the theme of trying to generate more units, as many units as possible with this QAP, while avoiding race to the bottom type criteria that some other states have tried, like encouraging all to promise lower cost per units, that kind of thing. No, those sorts of criteria don't work out well very quickly. So, but this does. This encourages you to make your deals more feasible. So you need fewer KHC resources, and also to have more participation and support from valuable partners. So the idea here is that certain sources are inherently eligible, but then you can, if you have another one that you think should be eligible, you could always ask. That's a possibility. And so, but of course you're not guaranteed. But these are the ones that, presuming they're not from a related party, would count. And so then these are the terms below, that they have to be 1% or less, at least 20 years, no commercial reasonable fees. And that's what a lot of these providers are going to do regardless. So, but again, we're open to, as with all these comments on the specifics of this, how to work it out. And so the way that this will be done is first looking at it on a per unit basis, and then, like with policy map, a comparison. So whoever has the most per unit gets the most points. And so that means that these providers of these local, especially local, but again, as you'll see, it's not just local, will have choices to make to decide how they want to prioritize who the competition. So again, it'll all be, and it means, again, it's relative. Whoever does better in this gets more points. And so that's the way competitions are. When you compete better in a particular thing, you do better in the competition. That's life. So that's the below market permanent sources. So obviously construction loans, bridge financing, that kind of thing wouldn't count. It has to be permanent loans. Comments, questions, debates. This is all pretty similar to what you'll find in other states also. It's not exactly a radical concept. All right, moving on. Land donation. This basically, as all of you know much better than me, that land is usually the greatest non-basis cost, generates the most pressure on deals. Reserves being the other one. And so this one here is, if you get that for free, then that's great for the deal feasibility. Makes your project that much more viable. And so, probably also is going to mean you are able to, get your deal going quicker. At least it should, at any rate. Wouldn't necessarily, of course, but odds are in most cases it would. So that's the idea here behind land donation, again, is making your deal that much more feasible. So questions or comments on that?
That land donation is limited towards donation from a government entity, land bank, just those few that are mentioned.
Yeah, the ones that are mentioned there, exactly. Yes, you can't give land to yourself, basically, or really any other one that's not listed there. But if you have an idea for something that should be included, please feel free to suggest that as a comment. That's the whole point of this, is that we're not omniscient. We have gaps in our knowledge and understanding that we want to hear from y'all as to how to make this better.
Why does it matter where the land comes from if it's donated?
Well, so that you don't get an advantage by donating it to yourself, basically. That's the immediate obvious answer. There's probably other ways to think about it, but that's the one that comes to mind to me. But I'd be happy for any of my KHC client colleagues to jump in if I've missed a thought on that one.
Mike Hines with Winterwood. A follow-up question to Michael Gross's question. What about nonprofit entities making the land donation, is if they're not involved in the development of the housing?
Yeah, that would be a comment to make. And what would help in that comment would be defining some examples of what that could look like, what kind of nonprofits, and how to ensure that if there's any thoughts you have about ensuring that they're not related party somehow. So, but yeah, again, wide open to thoughts on how else, because we want this to happen. We want there to be land donations. That's the whole point of this criteria. And so if there are other ways to have that happen, again, but wide open to thoughts along those lines. Other comments, questions? All right. So revitalization plan, this section 42 required preference for these, and this is basically the language that has been in place for a while, just slightly revised. But yes, there's really not much new or different about this. Yes, Tammy.
I do want to state on the revitalization plans that they want these to be in QCTs, but like the bigger cities, they don't go to QCTs because QCTs change like every 2 years or so. So it's difficult for them to put QCTs in their overall development plan, especially in Louisville. I mean, they don't look at QCTs, they look at the overall. So the overall area, because they do change so frequently. So I was just wanting to bring that up, that it's difficult to find those in the larger areas.
Understood. But just for the sake of being precise, it's technically not KHC that wants them to be in QCTs. It's section 42. So this is implementing the code preference. Now, granted, this isn't the only way that an agency can implement the preference, but the QCT has to at least be part of it. That's in there in section 42M. Yes, copy of the draft available. I think the copy of the draft is available at least to those who got the email, and it may be on the website somewhere. But yes, it's certainly available. Yeah, go ahead.
It is on our website.
Got it. Very good. Yep. And so, all right. Other thoughts on QC on the revitalization plan? So this next one, so question with NCSHA's recommended practices reducing barriers to local government. Well, so that comment there, going back up to this, the recommended practice says that local governments should not have their own distinct ability to give preferences, points, etc., to developments. And so and that's in two ways. One is not having other states emulate the Texas approach that is in their state law, where you have to give points based on local governments passing resolutions, that kind of thing. And that clearly that isn't in here because, just if I can step into my own opinion, that's a bad policy, and Texas needs to get right about that. Their state legislature, of course, not TDHCA. And then the other is in the form of material support. But you'll see here, it's not just localities that are able to do this. You've got multiple other possible ways that you can get this, and including really almost anything in this last paragraph below it here. So, but you certainly wouldn't want to leave out localities, and they're an obvious one because they've got probably the most money of all these. So they do have an ability to do this, and probably the greatest ability, but it's not unique to them. So in my opinion, that comports with the NCSHA recommended practice. But obviously someone could disagree. So this next category is really, to an extent, reflective of the Section 42 expectation to have certain selection criteria addressed. And pretty much every project is going to fall into one of these three categories anyway. For the most part, they'll be in one of the first two. And these first two are really no different than what has been in effect in Kentucky for a while. And so they're meant to be pretty much the same. The supportive housing language is reasonably new for Kentucky, but it's in place in multiple other states, and so it's not a brand new concept from a national perspective. And so, but again, my guess is most folks are probably going to do one of the first two, but any of these three would be equally the same. Yes, Adam.
Hi, this is Adam Haley with Goodwill of Kentucky. I had a question regarding the supportive housing component, specifically the line. I apologize. I'm going to read from this. That it ensures participation in supportive services is entirely voluntary, not a formal or implied condition of occupancy. While I know it's not currently law, do you have a understanding of how that would interact with the currently proposed House Bill 5, also known as the Safer Kentucky Act, and the language saying, notwithstanding any statute, no funds shall be expended by state or local officers, officials, employees for agencies and initiatives that provide permanent housing to homeless individuals if those initiatives lack behavioral and rehabilitative requirements. So just, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I hadn't heard of that happening until you just heard of that legislation until you just mentioned it. What I can say is the premise behind this type of language is that as a landlord-tenant relationship shouldn't be all that different in the low-income context as landlord-tenant relationships in other contexts, where there's no subsidy involved, or even homeowner-landlord. Homeowner mortgage lender.
And absolutely, I do want to clarify, just because we're talking to everybody. I'm not saying it should be one way or another. I simply, that jumped out at me in reading it, and also tracking this other piece of legislation, as just curious how you all saw those interacting. And I guess I see Curtis wants to chime in.
Adam, I can speak to that. Well, Curtis, unless you were gonna.
I was, but you're going to say the same thing I'm going to, Sam, I assume, so go right ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I'm Sam Thorner, I'm General Counsel for Kentucky Housing Corporation. So I think there are 2 points to be made about the application of that bill to this section. The first being, my understanding is that the current version of the bill does not include federal funding in that requirement. The second point is that, generally speaking, tax credits are not considered federal funding because there's not a direct allocation of dollars. It's a tax credit. So I think even if the final version of the bill were to include federal funding, it would not apply to these resources.
Okay, yeah, that is my understanding as well. Is it does this is limited to state funds that they actually recently removed federal. So because of the way these are structured, they are not state or local funds.
Yes, that's correct. Or at least that's my understanding of the bill as it is proposed and how it might apply to this proposed QAP.
Very good. Well, thank you, Samuel. Other questions, comments, thoughts on this section? All right. That just takes us to the tiebreakers, because got to have them just in case. And these also reflect Section 42 expectations. So that's it for the QAP. Here, 36 minutes in. Comments, questions overall on it before we go to the point scoring spreadsheet. Again, we can always come back to this. All right. Let me try sharing a different part of my screen here. Very good. Yep. All right. Hopefully y'all can see that. So KHC, I can't take credit for coming up with this spreadsheet. Someone on staff did. And so this would be publicly available. It's just wasn't ready as of yet, but it's not like this is any kind of secret or anything. This would be known. And so this is the breakout of the point score. So you can see these are all the same criteria that we talked about. And then they add up to 100 points, perhaps not coincidentally. And then you can see the breakouts, and they vary between urban and balance of state, even within categories. Like you can see right here, permanent below market sources, there's more of those that you're going to have in the urban areas, so they are a higher point value than they would be, than they are as proposed in the balance of state. So this is the, oh, and I forgot to mention, significant share of units, that's only, my apologies, I should have mentioned, that's only balance of state selection criteria. So it wouldn't apply, that doesn't apply in the 5 counties. It's only outside those. So this is the split. Y'all take a little while to look at it. Happy to have thoughts, comments, questions, debates, arguments.
Yes, this is Adam at Goodwill again. Sorry, I did have another comment / question.
Sure.
So in drafting the qualified allocation plan, how were comments that were already submitted weighed for inclusion? And I should say, specifically we're looking at the comments that I believe others and ourselves submitted regarding possible preference for justice-involved individuals.
Well, yeah, so that's one that I would always be happy to take on for myself, because that's not a QAP concept. That is a compliance manual concept. Justice-involved individuals have rights that apply to existing properties right now. And the QAP is only looking at stuff that's getting built 2 years from now. So you don't want to have those rights only kick in for projects that get built way in the future. And a lot of people focus on the QAP because it's the big high profile document. That's understandable, but it's the wrong place to talk about that kind of policy. It's got to be in the compliance manual. Again, if you want it to apply right now, which I would imagine you do. And so that's always my advice in states. And again, someone could argue with that, but it's really just the way contract law works. That this is a contract that's for the future things. And so whereas there's a lot of rights that just involved individuals folks have right now, but it's maybe there's another way to think about that I hadn't considered, but that's always been my perspective on it. Yeah, please jump in.
So I understand and I appreciate that. Definitely. I think we want to be mindful of making sure that we're respecting folks' rights. I think at least I'll speak to the comments we made, that the idea is if we were to include such a preference, that would positively increase the supply for that population, such that landlords would seek to focus on serving a population that is currently, for all the data we have, very underserved in an effort to be more competitive in the allocation of these credits.
Well, it's hard to respond to that without responding to a specific proposal, because what you described, it can sound a certain way to one person, but it can sound a completely different way to somebody else. And so the specifics of how to implement that. So that's why when I talk about that particular subject matter, I always focus on properties making sure they follow and comply with the existing rules, because the 2026 HUD, Office of General Counsel memo on criminal screening goes really far. It is a tremendously demanding from an agency, from an owner perspective document. It ends the notion of uniform rules, like you can't, like it says you can no longer have rules that apply across the board, like no felonies, for example. You can't do that as an owner. You can't take into account criminal screening. And that's not me coming up with some kind of legal opinion. That's what it says. And for a lot of others, that's groundbreaking. That's very different. You can't take into account arrest records in criminal screening, is what I meant to say. Oh, I don't know if I said that. But anyway, this isn't the time or place to talk about all the specifics. But those rules, enforcing those would go a long way towards helping folks that are justice involved. And that's not something you do in a QAP. That's something you do in a compliance manual.
Hey, Mark, I just want to add to what Adam said. This is Mark Holman from Goodwill. And I did read, your white paper it was published. You kind of reflected on the Obama era policy that you're referencing right now. One of the, I think the challenges of let's just use some numbers. Goodwill saw 6,000 people in 2013, and I think 90% of them had multiple issues, multiple barriers. And so, maybe the issues that people that are hoping not to re-enter the justice system, kind of similar to what Michigan did, Department of Corrections and their Department of their housing corporation, work together to prevent recidivism. That kind of collaboration helped to get developers, specifically get building housing for folks that, while it's not, I suppose, illegal to consider their criminal record, there's just so many other barriers, like lack of income, lack of transportation, inability to get a job because they do have a criminal background. That kind of supportive housing, in our opinion, in our experience for the last 3 years, is really the only way to make people successful who are coming out of prison and trying not to re-enter. Because I guess the joke about it is, the state is already paying for a very big housing stock, and that's called prison. We don't want them to pay for that, So it's kind of a way to incentivize nonprofits like us, selfishly, to say, hey, we want to build some housing for, we're renting currently all our housing stock, but we want to build some because it's such a great need in many Kentucky counties.
Well, and that certainly can be a comment to have attempt to have housing built to serve that population that would place in service 3 or 4 years from now. And if you can get through the NIMBY hurdles, and but upon doing that, you're going to have 60 units somewhere, and as opposed to working across the whole portfolio, which units that are available right now. So that's great advice. My suggestion would be to focus on the latter.
I think the latter is important, and for certainly it's both and. I just think the need's so great. In Jefferson County alone, we're talking about 9,000 people, and 75% of our employees, of 2,500 employees, have some kind of background. So their number one issue is always housing. So while the law is the law, the reality is these people are in danger, and when they don't have housing, generally they go back to their old ways and then they go back to jail. So
there's no one can argue
and then the reality.
Yeah, no one can argue with that. It's definitely an important need to serve. It's just a question of what's the best way to serve that need.
Understood. Thank you, Mark.
And so realize that was seemed somewhat of a niche topic, but it allowed everyone time to look at all these numbers. So other comments, questions? Patrick.
Yeah, Patrick Olding with Woda Cooper Companies. So in last year's QAP, the scoring was kind of set so that when we submit our applications in August, we know exactly what our site's going to score. But with this now being on a relative basis, are we no longer going to know going into our applications how we score? I mean, obviously we can have an idea based on these metrics, but will it not be decided until KHC's received all applications and ranked them and then given out a score?
That is correct. And the way that I explain that, hopefully everyone has heard the notion of good, fast, and cheap. You can have 2 out of those 3. Well, when it comes to scoring criteria, there's a similar phenomenon. There's 3 things. There's what you described, the ability to predict and know exactly what your points are going to be. There's points that actually make a difference in who wins and who loses. There's a variation in the scoring. And there's criteria that don't encourage people to do things like have a race to the bottom or all go to the exact same spot and have a bidding war for tracts, that kind of thing. So those are the 3 things, and you can only have 2 out of those 3. And that is a source of eternal frustration for everyone involved in this program. And it's amazing how many of the comments that come in on QAPs are about the absence of the 3rd thing in the criteria. In this case, the ability to predict what your score is going to be. If in some states, like where I know you apply in North Carolina, where I live, the frustration is that everyone gets the same site score. So they tried this year to open it up, to have more points, to have people allow, but everyone still knew what their score was going to be. And guess what? Almost everyone had exactly this maximum point score. So the complained about thing, everyone got the same site score, happened again because it was predictable. And so, or you can have it be that it's really, and what you can do is make it so that it's predictable, you know exactly what it's going to be, and make it really hard to work out, in which case you're going to fight really hard for those sites that are in, say, a half mile of a grocery store. We tried that once in the state where I worked, and it was bad because half mile, that's a very small area. I forget my 6th grade geometry, but it's not much is in that zone. And so people were spending way too much for land. So that's just how it is. You got to pick 2 out of those 3. And this picks that that makes a difference. There's a variation in scoring, and minimizes to an extent how much folks are going to go overboard with bidding up pieces of land, because you don't know that it's worth it to bid up a piece of land because you don't know what your competition is going to be. And ultimately, that's the reality of this. There's another thing that happens with developers is, and this is not just y'all, this is just national. And maybe someone could mute that echo, is folks want to know what their score is going to be. And that's realistic. That's understandable. But you ultimately don't know how you're going to compete because that's how life is. That's the NCAA tournament. It's competitive. You don't know what the outcome's going to be, as opposed to a gerrymandered legislative district. You know what the outcome's going to be, so you don't compete. That's just the reality of life.
Understood. Thank you.
And I'm not saying this is the right way to pick that. This is just one way to pick that. There's different ways. You can have these be that everyone gets the same score, and the scoring is done on some other basis, some other threshold, some other tiebreaker. I mean, in Florida, they have a lottery. People don't like that, but it's because everyone gets the maximum score because they know what their score is going to be. So a lot of thoughts from me, which I don't mean to say not all that is inherently right. But there's choices to make in there. other thoughts, comments, debates on this? And this will be available pretty soon, I would imagine. And we can come back to it. All right. So that takes us to our policy map demo. And I'm going to do my best with this, but having however many people are watching, as you can imagine, is a little nerve-wracking when you're doing this kind of thing. But any rate, I've done it before, so hopefully I'll be able to do it again. So first thing, what I've done here, you type in where you're going to go. If your address, you can just go straight to it on the map, but I've got an address here. And pick something I figured y'all would recognize. Hopefully everyone knows where that is. Let it be something, have it be something well known. So there you go. Something for which your state is very well known. So we'll pick an example of one of these. We'll pick the, income and spending, yeah. Always have to remember these. So you pick this right here, then you pick this one right here, the median household income. And then what you need to do is be sure to pick the correct level. So for this one, it's census tract, and then you want to lock it. So it doesn't vary because policy map will vary things on you when you zoom in and out. So what we've got here is if you were to try to build a project in the Kentucky Derby census tract, you would see this median household income is 65% of the area. And so what that would mean is it would not compete as well as this right here. This, wherever this is, Parkway Village, it has a higher one, so that would compete better. Whereas this area would compete better than this. Hopefully you can see the hover text here that I'm holding up, 41% for the area that's just to the west of it. So that's how that would work. And I went through it pretty fast, I know, but it is pretty fast. That's the point of it, is you can do this analysis pretty quickly and easily. And you click on that. If you want to click, you can see this is your census tract number. This is your median household income percent. And I'll add that I don't know what's going to be the product of it. We're working on instruction. Jake is more of an expert on all this than me because he's younger and smarter. But so he's done a lot of this analysis as well. And but yeah, so this is the idea. So you'd find some other site and look at it and compare to it, and then you submit these numbers, and that's pretty much how it would work. This one is based on 2020. Yeah, so I got the question. You can see down here it's based on census tract. And so we go back, what you'll see, go back to, have to switch back and forth. I wish I was sophisticated enough to show things multiply. I don't know how to do that. It may not even be possible. So we'll just switch back and forth. We'll go back to this other one here. So what I showed you here was median household income, but instead let's go to renter cost burdens. So that's what you do is you click on the housing tab, affordability cost burdens, renter cost burdens, all cost burdens. So now's the trick for me to remember all that. So I have to get one of y'all to help me. My memory's really bad as I get old. It's getting worse. Getting old is a bummer. All right, so now we share. So we stop this one. We end this layer. And so, right, it was housing, if I remember correctly. All right, affordability and cost burdens, renter cost burdens. Yeah. Hope I remembered this all correctly. There we go here. I believe this was zip code tabulation areas. If I remember correctly. And then, yeah, so you want to lock that. Hope I remembered that correctly, that it's zip code. Yeah. So yeah, this is the Yep. So then you see this is our renter cost burden for our tract, our zip code tabulation area right here. So the renter cost burden, sorry, the zip code tabulation area is renter cost burden is 58.48%. So that means there's that percent of renters who are cost burdened. So if you look over here next door, there's less renters who are cost burdened. So the idea being there's less need to provide affordable housing in that zip code tabulation area than there is here. So that's as much demonstration as I'd planned to do. Oh, I see there's some chat comments. Yeah, so I got a good comment here. All right, sorry, Andrew, I skipped past your, 68% or at or below. Yeah, there's explanations of all, I shouldn't try to go off of memory. There's explanations for all the data in this policy map thing. They provide a lot of it. And so you don't even have to use us to get answers for it. You can get it straight from these sources. Yeah, why is it measured at zip code tabulation and census tract? I don't remember why that was. Sound like someone maybe had a thought on that to explain it.
My understanding, Mark, if you don't mind me jumping in,
Yeah,
was that
please.
we were going to use census tracts because we wanted to try to use those as much as possible. But if it's determined that it needs to be something different, I know that typically we tend to like to keep things census tract across the board when it's possible.
Right.
Some of those borders are only going to be available for like block groups, for example. But we try to keep those consistent unless there's a reason otherwise. And I also wanted to point out, because Andrew had asked, and I answered there about the median income stat that we were using. Mark pointed out that little I button right there in the layer. That'll give you a brief explanation. And then there's also the data dictionary, which you can see up on the top right, which will give you more information on how it was collected and what it all means.
Yeah, there's no shortage of explanation of all this stuff. That's for sure. I mean, look at all this. Just goes on and on and on. Hopefully you're seeing my data dictionary there.
Hey, Mark, this is Anthony. Can you go back to that cost burden map and just see what it looks like on a census tract basis rather than zip code?
Yeah, I don't remember. I know that we liked census tracts, but I don't remember why because there's so much of this analysis that we did that yeah, so there's that census tract. So maybe this should go back to census tract, but we had a reason for it. Because I'm old, I don't remember what our reason was. All right. So I got a comment here that the rules perpetuate a concentration of poverty. It's actually the criteria of that we've got here of area median income does exactly the opposite. It encourages you to find sites that are in the higher income census tracts. So it's a conscious choice to, again, do the exact opposite of concentrate poverty. So as you find sites that are in higher income census tracts, you'll do better in this criteria. So that's the one that one actually explicitly goes after the concern you're expressing. Which criteria? This one right here. Median household income. Having a higher income gets you more points. Other questions, comments on any of the things that we've shared here? I think we were scheduled for longer than an hour, but we have gone an hour. So I know some people may have to leave. Yes, Tammy.
So is that it for the scoring? That's all that there's going to be?
Those are the scoring criteria. Yep. But I would say that I don't remember how many of these are relative to the number of scoring criteria that were in previous QAPs, but there's a lot more. What I am certain of is there's a lot more scoring criteria where the results are going to be different than there was in previous QAPs. There may be fewer total number of scoring criteria, but as I recall, the ones that were in effect for the previous one, some of those criteria had pretty much everyone get the same number of points, and that's only going to be the case for probably one of these criteria.
So is KHC increasing the credit per unit cap?
Well, that's a different document, and but you're certainly more than welcome to submit comments on that.
I think the majority of us on this call have already done that.
Yeah, and we just haven't. That's in the guidelines, and yeah. Yes, Adam.
This is more of a process question because it's new to me. Regarding the formal comment period that closes February 15th, what is the process for which KHC addresses comment, and is there an expectation of some kind of reaction from KHC or their comment on the comments that are submitted?
Yeah, I'll have to turn that over to Terry or Anthony. I don't understand there to be a standard practice of commenting on the comments. That is an expectation for HUD and one or two states, but I don't know that that happens, to my knowledge, in Kentucky.
Sorry, I was taking a few moments to unmute myself. This is Anthony Wright at Kentucky Housing. And Mark is correct. It is a requirement for HUD when they put out policy changes to comment on the comments they receive, but that is not something that KHC has historically done. The way it typically works, Adam, is that we will take all the comments that we receive, we will meet internally and discuss them, and those that make sense for us to respond to, we do. And there's no, of course, guarantee that every comment will receive consideration in the final work product.
Understood. I appreciate it.
And Anthony, while you're got your hand on the mute button, or maybe this would be for Terry, but there's a question in the chat about the anticipated release of the guidelines.
So I'll address that as well. That is really the last document that we update. We have to really land on the scoring and the QAP, because that will drive, what types of documents we have to require as part of the application submission. But we are hopeful that final guidelines could be out probably within the next 60 days.
Quick question on the policy map. Do you have to subscribe to get that information or pay?
No, it's all public. At least last time we checked, all that was available to anyone who didn't have a subscription, just on their public website.
Because when I click on the same information you were, it's telling me to log in or subscribe, and when I go to subscribe, it's asking me to give them information so they can price out how much they want to charge me.
Okay. Well, that wasn't our experience. Maybe something's going wrong there. because
I don't
it's
know if
definitely
anyone
meant to
else
be
on the
public.
call has managed to do it otherwise.
I think we had to pay for it too, Michael.
Well, that's certainly not the expectation. Yeah, I got some advice from Samuel there.
You should be able to close that. Yeah, no.
Because I tried it on a computer that for which I wasn't logged in, and I was able to get to all this stuff, but that was back in like November or December.
I mean, I can see when I scroll over, I can see like the numbers that you could see, but if you click on it to try to get like a table or any information, it says available to subscribers only. I mean, so are we supposed to just like roll over all the tracks and?
Yeah, no, you should. Yeah, that's well. Okay, that could be a problem.
Yeah, that's news to us. So
Yeah.
we will check into that.
Just keep in mind that I'm old and technologically not that savvy, so it may be user error.
When we were looking at what to measure, I know that as Mark said, we kind of intentionally went for things where we could log out and find them. So if there's any issue with that, I'm sure we can look into it. So apologies if that was the case, but it should not be the case.
Yeah, so apparently Patrick's been able to make it work. Yeah, but we definitely, the whole plan of this was for it to be available for free. We don't expect people to have to subscribe.
All right, so Patrick, you're just like scrolling over the map and just looking at the census tracts, right?
Yeah, when I input an address, I'm able to see what the score is, or what the percentage is for that certain census tract or block. But there's certain functionalities that are you're not able to do. Like Mark was locking the census tract, so when it changed, you're not able to do that. You're not able to do multiple layers without a subscription. So there's certain things, but in terms of getting the raw data for those 3 scoring criteria, you're able to do it without subscription.
Yeah, and the multiple layers thing is kind of difficult to do even with the subscription. I wasn't able to get my head around how to make that work. I know it's possible. That's one of those technological savvy things I just couldn't get my head around.
Yeah, and I guess I can see the percentages so that I'm having the same experience that Patrick was. I just thought that there'd be more functionality to the information.
Yeah, we just wanted to all that we're hoping for folks to be able to do is get that number, get that measurement, the percent.
Okay, so that works.
Other questions or comments?
Mike Hans, Winterwood, with a question about the private activity bonds and 4% credits.
Oh, right. Yeah.
What is KHC's thinking today? Even less legislation that may be moving in DC with the bond funding rounds and allocation process.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to turn that over to Terry or Anthony.
So, Mike, right now we will have a tax exempt bond NOFA. Hopefully it will be out in the spring. And once we have some definite information, we will get that out to you via our egrams.
Will the
Thank you, Terry.
scoring be the same as with the 9%?
For our bond projects, we typically just have threshold and preferences. They are currently not scored by a scoring number, but we do have preferences included in those in the bond applications.
Terry, did you say when you expect those to come out?
I'm hoping we'll have them out in the spring, if not sooner. I mean, I'm trying to get it out there as quickly as I can. So just keep an eye out on the egrams.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Well, we certainly, I guess, could be done.
Yes, thank you all very much for participating and all of your comments. For the comments regarding any of the scoring or the items that we have gone over today, if you can get those submitted to our email rentalqap@kyhousing.org. We would like to see those at least by the end of this week, if at all possible. So if there's anything that we need to look at and make any changes to or comment on, we would like to do that sooner rather than later, since our public hearing is coming up next Thursday. And if there's no other questions or comments, then we appreciate your time today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.